Hello, this is one of a series of presentations that I will be making on the European Union, what it is and how it works. The context for this is that the UK will soon be holding a referendum on whether to leave or stay in the EU, and it is important for everyone to have the facts about the EU before they vote so that they can make an informed choice. In future episodes, I will be covering topics such as the economy of the EU and how immigration affects the EU. In this first episode, however, I will be looking at governance. The governance of the EU. How is it governed? What institutions does it have? How do EU laws get made? And how do EU laws interact with the laws of the member nation states? In addition to covering these topics, I will be looking at some commonly made statements about the EU to investigate how true they are. Please note that this episode will be split into a number of different parts across multiple videos. First of all, a health warning. The EU can sometimes be a confusing organisation. This is especially true when it comes to governance. In my opinion, there are three main problems that lead to this confusion. The first problem is the naming of the institutions that make up the EU. The European Council, the European Central Bank, the Court of Justice of the EU, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, confusingly sometimes just referred to as the Council, are all different institutions of the EU, all with different responsibilities and powers. However, they all have similar names and, in some cases, similar logos. These similarities can make it difficult to work out which institution is responsible for what, and what the relationships between the institutions are. During this episode, I will be explaining the differences between a number of these institutions. This first problem is compounded by a second problem, which is the existence of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is a completely separate organisation to the EU, with different aims, different powers, and different members. Russia, for example, is a member of the Council of Europe, but not of the EU. However, once again, they have very similar names, and, as you can see, very similar logos. Journalists, politicians, and members of the public will often conflate the EU and the Council of Europe into one monolithic organisation that they refer to simply as Europe. It is important to note that the organisation of Europe does not exist, and that when anyone refers to it, they should be asked to clarify whether they mean the Council of Europe or the EU. The importance of clarifying this is that if a member state left one of these organisations, it would not necessarily mean that they left the other. Therefore, we should learn what the different powers and responsibilities of these different organisations are before choosing whether or not to leave either of them. To this end, I will spend some of this episode looking at one of the institutions of the Council of Europe that regularly gets confused as being one of the institutions of the EU. The third problem is that there are two different answers to the question, what is the EU? The first answer is that the EU is the beginning of a European state, sometimes referred to as the United States of Europe. The EU shares some features with a nation-state. It has an elected parliament. It can make legislation. It has its own currency. The second answer, however, is that the EU is another treaty organisation, like NATO or the WTO. This model of the EU can be seen in the fact that the direction and some of the executive and legislative functions of the EU are controlled by national governments. Different people within the EU favour one or other of these models, or a combination of both of them. However, the presence of these two models means that the EU ends up being a hybrid organisation that is neither one thing nor the other, thus leading to confusion. I will point out during this episode where these two models of the EU clash and where they work together. So those are the three aspects of EU governance that lead to confusion. Watch out for them during the rest of this episode. Here are the four statements commonly made about EU governance that I will be investigating in this episode. The first is that the EU is governed by unelected bureaucrats, often referred to as Eurocrats, who are forcing legislation on the UK from Brussels without any democratic legitimacy. The second is that the EU is forcing unwanted interpretations of human rights upon the UK, such as forcing us to give prisoners the right to vote. The third is that EU legislation is out of control, leading to claims that 50%, 70%, even 85% of national legislation comes from the EU. The fourth is that there is no point in us leaving the EU, as we would have to follow all of their legislation anyway if we wanted to trade with them. Join me for part 2 of this episode, in which I will be exploring some of the institutions that make up the EU and the Council of Europe.